Hello friends, my name is Ramirez, and today we're going to be talking about the 10 best books that I read in 2023. I read a total of 125 books, but narrowing down my top 10 was surprisingly easy. I had a reading year with a lot of high highs and low lows, but it averaged out to be pretty mediocre. I read a lot of books that were in that 3 and 3.5 star range, so these top ones definitely just floated to the top for me. I also tried to rank them in order, and I feel like if you ever watched me do favorite or top books of the year, you have heard me say how bad I am at ranking things, and that is true, and then I always rank them and I will again. Things are so close between some of these that you could ask me again next week what this ranking would be, and it might look a little bit different, but I did my best. I always also like to clarify that to me, the best books that you read in a year might be different than your favorite books that you read in a year. One is more about quality to me, and one is more about enjoyment. So my top 10 books is like a mixture of those two things. These are the books that I had the best time with, or that I appreciated the most, that I also think are well executed. So this is like the meeting of both quality and enjoyment. Number 10 on my list is a St. Martin's Press title, and it really is such a bummer that I can't tell you guys how much I appreciated this work. It just invited me to think a lot about the way that work explores like more difficult subject matters, and like the difference between exploring it and like condoning it, and the way that an author approaches that. I thought about this book a lot after I finished reading it, and I would love to tell you guys about it, but I am currently participating in the boycott against St. Martin's Press. This is a marketing boycott, which means that we are asking people not to promote these titles until St. Martin's Press can talk to us about the ways that they can ensure the safety and equity of their programs. And so for the time being, I will continue to withhold these reviews. And if St. Martin's Press decides that they no longer want to continue working with the influencers who said, hey, can you give us some assurances of safety here, then that's fine by me. I am happy to never feature another one of their titles on my channel again. Number 9 is What Happened to Ruthy Ramirez by Claire Jimenez. This is adult literary fiction about a Puerto Rican family living in Staten Island who discover that their long missing sister is a contestant on a reality TV show, and so they set out to go find her and bring her back home. This was an absolute surprise for me. I borrowed it from the library as an audiobook, specifically because I was scrolling through audiobooks that were available now, and this was during Hispanic Heritage Month. So when I saw this audiobook available, I saw that it was from a Puerto Rican author. I was like, oh cool, I'll just check this out. It was also incredibly short, so it was really appealing to me in that moment of something that I could just pick up and get through quickly, and I ended up being completely enamored with the experience of reading this book. I will say that this isn't one that I would necessarily recommend widely for a number of reasons. Number one, while it has this mystery element that's sort of leading the plot along, trying to discover what happened to their sister, and if this person on the TV is their sister, that really takes a backseat to all of the character things that are happening. So it is sort of a character-driven novel, but it is a very short novel. It is told in less than 250 pages, so it's not something that sits really deeply into character studies or character art. It feels more like a portrait of this family and of the things that they are going through, the grief that they are experiencing, and the different ways that they deal with and channel that grief. So it paints that picture very vividly, or at least it did for me, but it doesn't really have a ton of depth going into these characters. So I would recommend this for people who are interested in sort of those kind of snapshot books, is what I call them, where you're just kind of looking at a specific period of time for a number of characters. I happen to really love them, especially when they can sit the whole story and experience really well in the voices of these characters. But number 2 reason I wouldn't recommend it widely is because this book has like a potty mouth, basically. There are a ton of curse words throughout, and there is an authenticity to that, to the way that this family and these women would be speaking, but I understand that that is off-putting for some people. The best comparison to me was The Past is Red by Catherine M. Valenti, where that character as well tends to use a lot of curse words and is like very voicey. I felt the same way about this, but it worked really well for me because of that cohesion between the voice and the characters that were being presented. I think one of the reasons that it worked so well for me is because it resonated with me, and it felt like people that I have met before and I have known before before, and there was a lot of that thematic content about like Latina women and the struggles that they face and the grief that they face and the violence against women of color that I thought really struck a note for me. And the way that this was written was really punchy. It's got that kind of economical writing that packs a punch, particularly through some really quick and witty dialogue. As a story of grief and devastation and sort of sharing space with collective grief, I really found that I just could not put this down. And truly, when we got to the end, and particularly the last page, really just broke my heart. Number 8 is Vampires of El Norte by Isabel, and this is an adult historical romance with some horror and paranormal elements in it as well. This follows our main character Nena, who is the daughter of a wealthy rancher in 1840s Mexico. Throughout her life, her home is being threatened sort of by two sides. On one side by the Anglo settlers who are coming in from the north, and on the other by paranormal creatures that lurk in the shadows. She was once attacked by these creatures when she snuck out of her house at night to meet up with her best friend and burgeoning love interest Nestor. After Nina is attacked, Nestor thinks she is dead, and so he runs away, only to come back 9 years later and find out that she survived. I have heard all kinds of complaints about this book and why it didn't work for people. I think the main criticism that I heard that it was like not enough vampires, and the vampires are in the title, which you can kind of tell that I think that that is an annoying critique, particularly because I feel like the title is even pointing to the fact that the vampires it is speaking of are the ones from the north, so the settlers. So even that critique is like, that's not the vampires I was talking about. Like, there's obviously some other connections and some other thematic work that Cañas was interested in doing, but all of that, it said, all of its speculative elements aside, this is a romance. This is a historical romance between two characters, and I really appreciated the way that its speculative elements supported the romance. I will say that as a romance, it has a couple of elements that are not going to be for everyone. One is some angst and two is some miscommunication, and those are honestly two things that I don't even particularly enjoy. Like, they're not romance things that are high on my list. I tend to get a little annoyed when things get too angsty, and I also really hate when a plot could be kind of unraveled if just one person used their words. But the way that it was employed here really worked for me. I think primarily because I loved these characters. I loved Nina and Nestor. Like, within one chapter, I was like, I would give my life for these two. That's how immediately invested in them I became. And so watching them navigate their feelings and watching them sit in this angst, especially throughout the middle of the book where that is what we primarily do, is sort of sit in this angst, like I was eating it up because I was invested in the characters. I also feel like there was a way that like the miscommunication that was happening between them was understandable, and there were enough outside forces that were like helping it on, right? There were other people interested in these two people not being together. There were other people sort of feeding in the things that they thought about each other or the things that they thought had happened. And so that all worked really well for me. This was not like a 5-star read for me because I do feel like the pacing could have been tightened, and I do think that the angst went a little bit overboard, but generally I just think that this was incredibly enjoyable. I love books that genre blend, and I think that this does so very well. And I just really appreciate Cañas's writing. I feel like her writing is so metaphor rich, and there is a way that she just casually describes everything around her that creates something really atmospheric and lovely, and again helped me fall in love with these characters almost immediately. I liked The Hacienda when I read it. I thought that it had kind of similar issues, honestly, but I feel overall this is a stronger book, and it makes me really excited to watch Cañas's career because she's writing in a lane and in a space that I just really enjoy. I love the elements that she's pulling from and the way that she's pulling them together, and her writing just continues to be really rich and really enjoyable to me. Number 7 is Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This is an adult thriller about two ex-cons who have very little in common but come together to get revenge when their sons who were married are killed. This was another surprise for me because I picked this up for a reading project, and so I didn't have very many sort of expectations about this book. I read a handful of thrillers every year, but it isn't my primary genre, so I just kind of picked this up for the project, and I feel like I was very much engaged and blown away by how cinematic and fast-paced this was, while also managing to be like surprisingly deep in sort of what it was attempting. I wouldn't particularly call this like very subtle or nuanced at all. It is in fact very brutal and in your face, but the way that it attacked all of its elements while still bringing you along in this fast-paced crime thriller plot, I thought was just very deftly handled. I felt for all of the characters involved. We were watching them be men with very complicated morality who had very backwards ideas about their gay sons, but at the same time they were characterized enough that you understood their regret, you understood the ways that they were learning, you understood their deep sorrow for not being able to have learned these things while their sons were alive. Like, all of those emotions were just so clearly conveyed that this took me like on an entire emotional roller coaster. I couldn't put it down. It was page turning. And the way that Cosby writes, it's really interesting because I couldn't really, like, you know, months removed from this, I couldn't really tell you what about his writing style makes it this, but I just felt like I could picture this all like a movie in my head. That's how it played. And so I just appreciate the skill to be able to do that and balance that with some really interesting character work as well. Number 6 is Swordheart by T. Kingfisher. This is an adult fantasy romance about a woman named Hala who, after losing her husband, also inherits the estate of her great uncle. And along with that inheritance comes a number of problems, including her relatives who are chomping at the bit to take it away from her. One of the things that she has inherited is an enchanted sword. There is an immortal being trapped within the sword, and when Hala draws the sword, he is then sworn to protect her, and they go on this journey together to help Hala try and preserve her estate and survive her relatives. This is a pretty plot light, low stakes sort of fantasy romance. I would even call this cozy, and I have an issue, or I've had an issue with a lot of the cozy fantasies that I've read in the past because of the way that it deals with stakes. I understand that, like, to be cozy, you're looking at something that does have some lower stakes, but I feel like too many times what the book is giving us is like no stakes, or it's bringing up some really high stakes and then just kind of hand waving over them. I found that Swordheart did a really excellent job giving the characters high stakes that didn't feel super stressful for us, the readers. Like, Hala was very interested in all of these things that she had to do with her relatives and her inheritance and all of that, but it still played in a way that was cozy enough for the reader. I've also read Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, which has some darker subject matters and elements, but still manages to read cozy. And I've read her Wizard's Guide, the baking wizard's guide, you know, the baking one. I read that one, which again had high stakes. It was about protecting a city, and like a whole battle ensues, and there was a scene in that book that like genuinely made me cry, but at the same time it's like, you know, battle by baking, so it has cozy elements. So I think T. Kingfisher knows how to get this balance very right. It's a balance that I don't always particularly find in cozy reads, but she nailed it for me in Swordheart. I loved these characters so much. There is a way that Hala's characterization comes through a lot of repetition. Like, we're told a lot about like certain of her personality traits, and so it can become a little bit grating, but I ultimately enjoyed Hala as a character so much. I love the way that she used people's perception of her against them. I love the way that she just kept like trying and persevering. I really enjoyed her relationship with Sarkis, the sword. There is something of miscommunication between them because they both have specific ideas about like what this relationship is and where it will go. But ultimately, I think that it was resolved in like a good pace, and I enjoyed them together so much that I was kind of willing to overlook when they were kind of both being butt heads about the situation. I love that Hala was like an older female character. She had been married once before, And honestly, I would have spent another like couple hundred pages with these two characters just kind of going about their merry way on their little road trips, encountering characters. That's how much I loved each of these characters and their interactions together. Number 5 is Happy Place by Emily Henry. This is an adult romance about Harriet and Wynne, who have been together since college, but they broke up 6 months ago and they have not told their friends. And so they've got a trip planned with these friends. It will be their last time going to this place, their happy place, all together. So Harriet and Wynne decide to keep up the ruse in order not to ruin the vacation for everyone else. I enjoy Emily Henry's romances generally. I think it's really interesting the way that even amongst Emily Henry fans, there's so much variation in what people think are her best works. But even across all of her works, the thing that I really enjoy here is her writing. I find she has an excellent quality to her writing, particularly in her dialogue. It is a lot. I feel like she's got a very wordy style in her dialogue. It's very quick and witty dialogue. It kind of feels like a lot, but I enjoy that element of it so much, especially in a romance where like the whole thing is character interaction and dialogue and back and forth. I think that Henry really nails that. That said, the last Emily Henry book that I read was Book Lovers, and I was a little, like, it was good, but I was a little disappointed in that one overall. One of my other favorite Emily Henry things is like how meta her work can be, but I think in Book Lovers it went a little too ham for me, and that book became just entirely way too self-aware. There's a way that it talked about like being in the story while I was reading the story that never let me sink into the story. I also didn't like super love the characters. They didn't feel as memorable to me as some of her other characters. So coming off of the Book Lovers experience, I was like a little like eh. And then I started to hear really bad first impressions of Happy Place. So I was like super nervous going into this one. I was like, oh man, maybe it was like a fluke with me and Emily Henry books. But I was so pleasantly surprised by how much I loved this one. I am not somebody who feels some type of way about second chance romances. I enjoy them when they are done right. And the thing that I really appreciated here was the way that like the back and forth between the characters set the stage well. Like I felt like I understood why these two people fell in love and what they saw in each other. And as we were building towards like the why they may have broken up, I was involved in the characters enough that I was emotionally invested. Even when I wanted to like shake them and be like, yeah, talk to each other, understand each other, like that level of frustration, like Emily Henry brought that out in me by getting me invested in her characters. And ultimately, I kind of did understand where they were coming from in terms of why their relationship started to break down. But even knowing my happily ever after was coming, I was like on the edge of my seat waiting for these two people to figure out how to be together. I loved their chemistry so much. And there's always a lot of like additional elements in an Emily Henry romance where she's talking about families and grief, and they can be heavier subject matters as well, but I appreciate that balance between like the romance and the angst and all of that with some other things that she's sort of exploring in other relationships, and all of those elements here I thought were pretty interesting. As I was reading this, I remember the feeling of like hitting these milestones in your life and growing apart from your friends and trying to protect that at all costs, and being really worried about like what if we lose sort of shared spaces, right? We came together because we were in school, we lived together, we have this vacation we always go to, but what happens when you lose those shared spaces as life takes you apart, as we move, like how do you maintain relationships? And so while it kind of seems silly that they were doing this whole thing to keep it from their friends on one side, like I still really deeply understood the sentiments underlying there in terms of like the investment in preserving the things that mean a lot to you. Emotionally, this was a hit. Emily Henry's writing is always a hit for me. The characters were a hit. I loved Wynne and Harriet so much. I loved Wynne's whole like thing about feeling uninteresting and really feeling that as somebody would get to know him, that he just would be just like a normal guy or like, you know, not very exciting. That felt like a really interesting sort of problem or characteristic to give to a character, and it made him incredibly endearing. So I found that these characters were much more memorable to me than some other of Emily Henry's characters. Overall, I was so glad that this one worked for me. I was so worried, but it hit. So now, I don't know if this is going to be the cycle, but I'm like way looking forward to her next book. But like I said, even when it's not not like my favorite Emily Henry. Like, I like what she's doing. Number 4 is the entire Locked Tomb series. A little bit of a cheat here, but I read all of them in a matter of days. So really they exist in my head as like one entity. This is an adult science fiction story. How explain? So this follows Gideon, who is trying to escape her life of indentured servitude to the 9th house, which is currently mostly being led by the Reverend Doddard Harrowheart, who is a necromancer. Now, as Gideon is almost escaping, Harrow pulls her back in and basically says that she will give Gideon her freedom if she does one more thing for Harrow. The Emperor has called all of the heirs to the houses to come and basically participate in a series of trials in order to gain a life of immortality serving the Emperor. But in order for Harrow to go participate, she needs a swords person to go along with her, and so she tells Gideon, if you go with me, if you help me do these trials, I will set you free. And so they set up on this adventure, and truly that is just like a little bitty tipping point, starting point for this entire series that is so entirely complicated and involved, and I love it. I honestly, I gave this book 4 stars, so of all of like the books that I've been showing you, this is like 4 stars is kind of like the lowest in my top 10 that I've rated anything. I thought about putting this higher. It honestly could be closer to number 1 for the way that it lives in my feelings. I am officially sort of obsessed with this, honestly, and all I've thought about since I finished reading the series is going back and rereading the series. I started to, and then I immediately was like, Mari, I put the brakes on and I promised myself that I could go back and do like a full, really deep reread once we knew that the final book, Alecto, was coming out, which it probably will at this point in 2025. So that's like how immediately invested and obsessed that I was with this. It is very particular in sort of its style and its voice and in what it's doing. So somebody told me I actually hated that book. Like, I get it. I feel like there is a way that it is very convoluted, and in a way that you are either going to have a ton of fun sort of sitting in and picking apart, or you're not going to have any fun with that at all. I think for the most part, a lot of that complication and that complexity and a lot of that confusion is Muir purposefully messing with you. All 3 of her books are so incredibly different, but they all 3 share some elements, and one is the way that they play around with unreliable narrators, which is just a trope that I absolutely love. I love an unreliable narrator, and the way that that is used throughout the series is so delicious. And 2 is that you have this sort of setup to each of her books. In the beginning, you have absolutely no idea what's going on. You're just kind of reading and letting it wash over you, like, what is even happening? In the middle, you're kind of like, oh, okay, like, I get it. And then you're putting things together in a way where you're starting to see the full picture. And then in the last third of the book, she's completely flipped that on its head, and everything you thought you knew is nothing that you knew at all. And so you're going through that experience as you move along her books, which again is not going to be a very enjoyable experience for everybody, but I just found it incredibly rewarding, especially for all of the ways that this tackles its themes. I think it has some really excellent themes about grief and morality, but also about humanity. And as you moved through the story, you really start to get more of a sense of like where we even are and when we are, and like all of the ways that that continues to emphasize its themes about humanity is just like truly brilliant. And this also really works because even as I was sitting in the confusion of the plot itself, I was enamored with the characters, and it took me a while to get there because when I started this book, I was like, what the hell? Like, kind of everybody is annoying me, but especially Harrow. And I ended this book and I was like, you know, I can't stand Harrow. I don't know where this book is going, but I resent where it's going. And then the series kind of changed my mind from there. It didn't change my mind about Harrow as a character. A lot of what Harrow does is awful, but Harrow pays for her actions. She pays high prices for her actions, and then you start to really feel like that is a child that is like was a little shit, but also like everybody is so young, and like the things that they are going through, these are incredibly high prices to pay. And so it really starts to reframe your understanding of the character, and it does this for several characters. Everybody's so complicated, everybody's motivations are so complicated, and this really is just such a bright set of very memorable characters, very memorable moments and scenes, and it's got all of this like self-referential humor. It pulls in a lot of like pop culture and meme humor. Again, not going to be for everyone, but it really worked for me, especially for the balance of like sci-fi setting with like modern sensibilities. I loved the way that it came together in this. I could honestly gush and gush about this series that wasn't perfect but hit me right in the feels, and I think is so ambitious. It feels so unique. It is unlike anything I have ever read before. I'm obsessed. I am obsessed with these books now. Number 3 is How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith, and this is a non-fiction book. And in this book, Smith takes us on a tour of places and cities, giving us a history of slavery in those places and tying that more largely to the history of slavery in America. Even if you are somebody who is not a non-fiction reader, I found this incredibly moving and accessible. Smith is a poet, and he drives his project through narratives, through telling stories, through interviewing people, and through giving us the stories of places as well, of rooting what we've heard in history or what we may have never heard or learned in history in actual places. I thought the way that he combined history and story and used language as a vehicle to deliver all that was just really effective. I enjoyed the balance of history and personal reflection, and I thought that all of the arguments that he made were ultimately very clear and concise, even though they were housed in these portraits that were very full and very observant. Number 2 is How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz. This is an adult contemporary literary fiction about a woman in her 50s who loses her job during the Great Recession. So she's back in the job market after many years, and she's set up with a job counselor and has to attend 12 sessions. And over the course of these 12 sessions, she ends up just sort of like narrating her life story to this job counselor. I listened to this on audiobook, and I think that that is an excellent way to consume this story. The audiobook does have like a few quirks in terms of a very prominent sort of thematic or like visual element of this is water, and throughout her sessions, the main character is drinking a lot of water. So you sometimes hear like those swallowing sounds in the audiobook, which I know is kind of a turnoff, but I listened to my audiobooks sped up enough that it did not bother me. And in fact, the performance added so much to this story that I still very much recommend consuming it that way if you can. I think that this is an excellent character portrait. I think it does a wonderful job of introducing us to a character who is very complicated, of a woman in the second half of her life, sort of set in some of her ways, but the story doesn't necessarily excuse her for the things that she has done in her life, especially the terrible ways that she has sometimes treated her son, but it does help you understand her as a character and her motivation. And particularly, I think that that's why it hit very much for me, is because it resonated with me. Angie Cruz is a Dominican writer, the main character is a Dominican character, and there were so many ways that I thought of women that I know while reading from this perspective, and I think it did very well by the character connecting some of the experiences that she had and sort of the things that were the norm for her growing up in a different country, and sort of translating that to how she treated others and unpacking that, right? And there was enough in the story where it sort of challenged her views and the things that she had done that I thought made this a really worthwhile character study. It hit me in the emotions, but I also just think in sort of its format and the way it approaches a character study and the way that it interjects sort of like all of these little pieces of building out Gara and her life through these counseling sessions. It was all just very witty. There were moments where I was cracking up, there was moments that I was in my feelings, and it gave me that full range, which I really appreciated, all in such economy. I loved it. I love when a book can pack a punch. Every word is measured and every word is there to do a job, and it does it well. And number 1 is Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. translated by Elizabeth Jaquette. I honestly went back and forth between 1 and 2, but it was sitting down here talking about it that I realized how much Minor Detail has stuck with me and how I'm going to tie this work very specifically to this year and reading it while also witnessing the genocide that is happening in Palestine. This is an adult historical fiction that is told in two different perspectives. The first is 1 year after the Nakba. An Israeli soldier captures, rapes, and kills a Palestinian woman, and then many years later a woman comes across this story and she becomes sort of fixated on the minor detail that they both share a birthday. And so she decides to try and learn more about this event, but that is incredibly difficult for her to do living in an occupied Palestine. I think that this is such an incredible work. There's a way that this used language and literary devices in order to deliver this story, and it was like incredible to experience real time because I was reading this first point of view that is very robotic and almost cyclical and repetitive, and I just kept thinking to myself, is this Shibli style? Like, is this purposeful? Like, what exactly is going on here? And even in this very sort of robotic telling, you're still very much experience how absolutely horrific it is what this Israeli soldier is doing to this woman. And then we head into the second point of view, and there's such a like audible, visible sort of shift in the way that the narrative is being delivered, so you very much understand that that was a choice, and it was such a smart one to continue to feed into the themes, especially about like how removed you have to be from humanity to do what that first character did, and all of the symbolism that she used about like the wound that he gets on his leg that is left to sort of rot, and the way that this man exists sort of in opposition to his surroundings, and the way that he is constantly fighting against nature but also sort of like losing to his worst nature. Like, all of those things were so deliberate and so beautifully delivered. As we move into the second part of the story, it just becomes so much more heart-wrenching, especially as how the Palestinian woman's point of view is sometimes so funny. It is delivered with such a matter-of-factness, like she is just going about her life, but there's a way that you can really tell what difficulty she has just trying to like find out more about this woman. I love when books have a title that like have more meaning the more that you read the book or as you finish the book. And so the back of the book blurb tells you that the minor detail that connects these two women is that they share a birthday. But the more you read and the more you sit in this tragedy, the more you connect all of the different things that connect their lives and their experiences, from just like violence and the experience of occupation, but also just being sort of women, if not forgotten by history, at least being swallowed by the enormity of what the Palestinian people have gone through. And again, this was just so well crafted. It was such a well crafted book. I did a review on TikTok as soon as I finished reading this, and I say, like, this is the thing that I know I've said in the past, or like, I will not stop thinking about this book for a long time, and I can tell you 3 or so months after reading this that is true. Like, I think about this book all of the time. If you have not read it already, I highly recommend picking it up, both because this just unfortunately just continues to be a very timely story, but also because I think that this is excellently crafted and just such a good example of a story that is put together so purposefully and executed flawlessly. That's it for me today. Those are my top 10. If you have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat in the comments. If you are interested in hearing about my numbers 11 through 20, I will have that video up exclusively for my members over on Bindery. My Bindery works just like a Patreon, so you can pledge a monthly amount, and that will give you access to all of my exclusive videos and also access to my exclusive community on Discord. And I will just say that this is going to be an incredibly exciting year to follow me along on Bindery. So if you want to see everything that's coming up for me in the new year with Mareas, I highly encourage you to get in on the ground floor, sign up at mareas.binderybooks.com. I will leave all of the information in the description, as well as link my bookshelf that will have all of the books that I talked about today with affiliate links. What you can expect from me next are my bottom 10 least favorite reads of the year and collaboration videos. So I asked a bunch of friends what their favorite books were and what their least favorite books were, so I'm putting them up together, and you guys should see that on my channel here shortly. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon.